Welcome to Eventual Consistency. I'm Ross Katz from Cordine, and today I'm joined by James Winegar. Today we're talking about a story that's easy to miss if you're not paying close attention to the infrastructure layer of AI. But if you are, it's one of the most consequential developments of the past year. Anthropic's Model Context Protocol, or MCP, just crossed 97 million installs in 16 months. Every major AI provider is now shipping compatible tooling, and the vendors that are building on top of AI are also shipping MCPs as well. What started as one company's open standard for connecting AI agents to external data and systems has quietly become the de facto plumbing of the agentic AI world. We work at the intersection of AI systems and enterprise data architecture, so we've been watching this play out up close. We're here to talk about what it means for the companies building on it, the enterprises adopting it, and the data leaders who are going to be asked to make decisions about it very soon if they haven't already. In March 2026, Digital Applied reported that Anthropic's Model Context Protocol had crossed 97 million installs, reaching that milestone in just 16 months since its release. For context, that's a faster adoption curve than most enterprise infrastructure standards ever achieve, including some that now underpin the entire internet. MCP is a protocol, an open standard that defines how AI agents connect to external tools, data sources, and services. Think of it as the USB standard for agentic AI. Instead of every AI system needing a custom integration with every data source, MCP creates a common interface that any compliant agent can use to talk to any compliant tool. File systems, databases, APIs, SaaS platforms, if it has an MCP server, an agent can work with it. What makes the 97 million number significant isn't just scale. It's who's behind it. OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, and the major model providers are all now shipping MCP-compatible tooling. This isn't a proprietary Anthropic play anymore, it's an industry standard, and industry standards, once they reach critical mass, tend to become permanent infrastructure. For data leaders and enterprise architects, this changes the question from, should we pay attention to MCP, to how do we build for a world where MCP is the default interface between AI agents and our data? So James, you've been working in AI and in the agentic infrastructure space for a long time. When you saw the 97 million install number and the fact that OpenAI and Google are both now shipping MCP-compatible tooling, what was your read? Is this the moment a standard becomes infrastructure, or is it still too early to call?
I mean, like it was standardized like the first week after it got built because, you know, 500 different companies built the tooling around the idea because it got them into the ecosystem. So like the 97 million installs kind of like that's already told you that it's happened instead of is it happening now? Like when we passed a million, it was there.
Yep. But what does that mean that it's happened? So MCP is it a standard or is it the standard? I guess is kind of the follow-up question to that.
The fundamental like existence reason for an MCP is to integrate 9,000 different tools to 9,000 other tools using, Claude or, GPT 5.4 or whatever to everything else, right? So a organization like Anthropic developed a standard to drive utilization of their platform based off the token economy. And because it worked good enough and handled some of the, edge cases good enough, it got pretty much brought to market within a couple weeks across many of the major players like, Microsoft, Google, Anthropic, etc. And we've just been seeing it do more and more since then. But at the end of the day, like all the original tools that still existed are still there. So, like Claude or ChatGPT or whatever, they've been good at interacting with your terminal, doing work, etc. So this is a CLI, based approach to doing things still there. The natural language approach to doing things is still there, and then the MCP is there. And there's like different needs in like the user journeys. So when I'm coding, like I'm mostly going to be using some of the CLI tools because of the systems that I'm integrating with. when I'm doing like query development, I'm going to be mostly using the MCP to talk to our different data warehouse vendors that we work with. And then when I'm doing like some research type thing, and then I'm going to be just talking to in natural language to Claude. And so like all three of those interfaces still exist. And we just added MCP for those parts where their CLI isn't as rich and robust as it was.
Yeah, I mean, I think the so first of all, like, what is the problem that MCP was meant to solve? It like to sort of dive a little bit deeper into what you were saying. It's basically like, if you wanted to integrate AI with all of the different SaaS vendors, for example, that your company uses, your Slack or your email or your Wiki, your Confluence, your Notion, ordinarily that would have required you to create sort of like API wrappers with custom tooling that maybe your team would have to maintain. And part of the goal here is to create sort of a way for AI to know what the access patterns are for each of the systems that it's going to use, and then what are the tools that are available to it in order to use those tools. But previously, for more coding focused tools, command line interfaces or CLIs, would expose sort of similar functionality. You would just, type -- help, and it would and it would tell you these are the tools that are available. So I guess, one of the things that interests me to dive like is we have CLIs for some of the tools. We have MCPs for other tools, and sometimes there's a CLI option and an MCP option available. So what is your perspective on when people should be using one or the other?
Well, it's really up to the vendors to decide that because it takes like effort from the vendor to build out a CLI or to build out an MCP. Think that the MCP is good in the like get something to market quickly and where the ecosystem surface area is relatively straightforward and small. So Slack, right? I got I can make it more complicated, but roughly speaking, like I got channels and I got messages. I need to be able to search those, public, private, direct messages, etc. There's not that many tools. There's like, 15 tools in the Slack MCP, I think. Don't quote me on that. But then you got like the Databricks CLI, which has, probably 1,000 tools. That's just like a little too much for the MCP context to handle because of just the way that the interface works. And then you got like Google's CLI, which is some monstrosity in terms of how big it is. And so like you can't do anything with it with the MCP basically. You run out of the context window just doing the single call. And so like go back to, what's the purpose of this MCP? I mean, I can imagine a world, and this isn't happening right now, but I can imagine a world where like we have multiple MCPs to support different workflows within a given like, technology vendor. So like I was thinking about this with like Post Hog, where they have kind of like a lot of different products that are fairly like independent of each other. I could imagine, you know, my event analytics, Post Hog, like MCP, and then my like actual data warehouse MCP within Post Hog or something like that, right? We've seen things with Mother Duck as an example where their MCPs they got a really tight loop because there's like 12 tools in it. But I could also imagine a world where they make an administrative MCP for various administrative actions for security controls and things like that, which you don't want in the loop for your regular user, right? So I can imagine these types of things. And then if you get to the point where you have 5 MCPs, really should you be making a CLI that supports like, the breakout of these things because you can do the dash dash help, on top of it. So like it doesn't take that long to get a good MVP of an MCP out, but it is takes a long time to build a good CLI, even with AI tooling to support these companies because pretty much like you end up in a place where people are interfacing with it instead of machines interfacing with it. So like I can update my MCP tomorrow, the LLM is going to figure out those things and make appropriate actions because all the context is there. If I change my CLI, like, because people have written scripts or things like that, it's going to cause breaking changes. And so I can't like be as agile with it. So what I think is, startups are going to be more MCP focused until they reach a level of maturity where they say, okay, we got 5 MCPs, we can't be doing this. Okay, now let's like, but we have a design definition based off of that now. And so now we can go out and build like a CLI or something like that to support like the different workflows that exist.
The way that this comes up with the clients that we work with is companies want to expose their data across the various different interfaces in which it's exposed to internal users, and in some cases external users, in order to give both the AI agents that are querying on their behalf and the end users the best possible interface for and the best possible architecture for exposing that data efficiently and effectively. So how do you think about that from an architecture perspective or from a tooling selection perspective in terms of advising companies on how to make their data available to API or to AI, excuse me?
Yeah, so in general, I don't think that there's a perfect solution for everybody. One of the things we've been dealing with fairly recently, I would say, 2026, is this idea that like Claude is this magical being that can do whatever you want and like, it's gonna be able to walk on water, all these things. And really, like all that's all that's ha really happened is we've opened up the context window, and its memory like efficiency as the context window gets larger has gotten good enough to pass, like similar to like when ChatGPT first came out. It was like it passed that threshold for good enough, right? And so what we're seeing a lot of is people saying, "Oh, I can skip all of the like fundamental work." Because that takes a lot of time, effort, energy, thought, etc. to get there. And I'll just be able to throw Claude at it. Now, that might be true in a long, long time from now, but it's not true today, right? And your cost economics, change here too. But so like if I have like Salesforce and a data warehouse and I don't know 5 other SaaS tools that my question interact my ERP, right? I want to know which customers have had good standing, with us but are at risk of churning and creating a marketing campaign to engage with those customers. Right. Okay. So I gotta go call APIs in Salesforce. They've recently increased the cost of the API calls on Salesforce because the consumption of the API has gone up dramatically with the use of AI agents and things like that. And every other SaaS platform I'm talking with their MCP protocol because they built out an MCP because that gets in the market faster than like the CLI that we were talking about earlier. And now, like my overall consumption of like the compute credits and token credits, etc., is like going through the roof. And then all that data will have to get brought into context within Claude or ChatGPT or whatever. And then it's going to have to do some ad hoc analysis, which means it's going to be writing code on the fly, and then trying to do that aggregation or whatever within the Claude environment, which might not even be tenable in itself, just based off the volume, right? And then, I'll get some answer. And that answer is not going to be correct, to a certain fidelity level, because no definition of revenue has come in. What does churn mean? Like, what are the things that actually indicate churn? Like, is it late payments? I don't know. We just said that we were talking about good standing customers that have some risk to churn, right? So, like, what are the signals that we're going to use? And I ask Claude that right now, and I ask Claude that tomorrow. I'll get the totally different answers, even if the data was still the same, right? So, so because of that, don't think that like any of these tools will be able to just like magically solve people's data problems. Right. Now, we make money because we help people solve the problem I'm about to say, but I still feels pretty strongly that like it's required, at least for the time being. It's like bring your data together, get it into the source system, Snowflake, Mother Duck, Databricks, pick your poison, right? Do some data modeling there, like, get the ability to define what is a customer, what is my revenue, what is my lifetime value of a customer, Now, when I ask, ChatGPT or Claude, hey, go look at my customer data, which is like this really nice, metriced out semantic model for customers, and tell me which of these customers, meet this criteria. And maybe it'll do a couple of joins with some event data or something like that. But we've turned it into like go grab data from 5 different sources, figure out how to do it on the fly, bring it in together, do something within the Claude context to analyze the data, to go run some queries in my data warehouse where I have a bunch of commenting, things like that, which we know increases the validity of LLMs, their ability to answer questions more effectively, yada, yada, yada. And my cost, has gone down dramatically, at least on that query side. Now, I still had to pay the money for like somebody like us or, my internal team to build out that semantic model, but I was able to get an answer relatively quickly, based off of that with like I would say reasonable fidelity up to like the natural language question that I asked, and how meaty is that question relative to the context that's available inside the warehouse. And so, you know, it kind of backing back out like that original flow of like talking to Salesforce and then my other SaaS applications and then doing all that stuff. I think you're going to get like a 50% fidelity from that type of thing. And really for this type of campaign that I kind of outlined, you're probably looking for like an 80/20 or a 90/10 type of thing. Like you don't like if you send it to a few people extra, it's not a big deal. If you don't send it to a few people, it's not a big deal because you're really just trying to activate like just like, hey, we care kind of messaging, right? And then, but when we get it modeled, I think we're really closer to that 80/20 as long as we have like a pretty tight loop on like, hey, this is where my customer data is and some of the supporting information I might use for churn or something like that. And then, the higher that fidelity requirement goes, the less comfortable I am with like LLMs doing the work. Now I'll tell you like 99% of the work that like I'll do on asking these types of questions is going to happen in an LLM until I need like, that high fidelity work.
Yeah, so I think the like just pulling apart the pieces of what you said there, the beauty of the data warehouse that already has the data integrated and modeled is that, any question you ask about the systems that have already been integrated can be run at relatively low cost across basically all of the history and with very high all of the history that you have in your data sets and with very high fidelity because you've already done the work to validate exactly how these queries should be run, and you've also already done the work to expose to AI exactly how to run those queries or what it needs to query in order to get the answer to a specific type of question. So in doing that, you've effectively scaffolded AI. You've given it the context that it needs to get the right answer. But the other thing that you touched on, but I want to dig a little bit deeper into, is this idea that okay, we have companies that have both structured and unstructured data, and then they have these like long horizon questions, like who are like the one you brought up, who are my customers who are in good standing, who fit the criteria that I want to rope into this marketing campaign. But then also you might have some real-time information that you want to gather about those customers. And so I think this is an interesting sort of proof point in terms of, how to think. I think what we would recommend based on the conversations we've been having recently is you get your structured data nicely modeled in the data warehouse so that you can get an idea of who the customer universe is. But then you also give Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini the ability to reference where to find that customer in Salesforce and that customer in Zendesk and that customer in the ERP system, so that for the specific universe of customers that you need that real-time information or that additional unstructured information about those entities, Claude then has either the MCP or the CLI available inside of its context to then very judiciously gather the context about those specific customers that it needs versus, querying the universes of customers in your ERP and then trying to do that work across a variety of different disintegrated systems. So that's kind of the picture that came to me as I was hearing you talk. What do you think about that picture? What would you add to that?
Well, like your ERP is going to fall over under that type of load. Like, and your ERP usually is going to be business critical to your operations. So, if you're manufacturing, you're running SAP or something like that, you can't just be running wild queries against it to gather all the customer information. Like, you got to move it somewhere else. Like, or you're paying, $10 million a year for S/4HANA, and you really should be paying one or something like that, just because of the amount of compute that you're pushing against it. So, I think a lot of this ties back to the economics of the problem, right? Like there are some questions that you can't answer with like reasonable fidelity quickly using the LLM tools to go call out to the source systems. There's the whole security thing to talk about from that viewpoint. But okay, but then it's going to cost me tons of money to do that. I might get answers quicker, but I'm trading time to information for the fidelity of the answer and the cost of getting that answer. So if I push the data into a data warehouse, pick your poison on how to get there, and I'm in the data warehouse, and then I have done data modeling there based off of my latency requirements, then I'm able to ask those questions in that ecosystem. I have decreased the cost on like the runtime expense by trading the engineering time it takes to get all that stuff loaded. And by proxy of that, my fidelity of my answer should also go up, right? Because I've done all these transformations, I have tested outputs, I run audits, et cetera, to make sure that when we make changes, it doesn't break our understanding of what revenue means, etc.
Yeah, and I would also add that your scalability dynamics look a lot better. As you go from
Yeah,
10
yeah. As
users
for
trying to do it, then to 100 users to 1,000 users. That you've said to me recently that a cost problem is just a performance problem hiding in plain sight. When you increase the performance of those queries, you're also making it much more scalable for you to get that high fidelity answer to more people across your company as
Yeah,
well.
yeah. So at least from the data ecosystem viewpoint, like a cost problem is usually a performance problem. If I optimize the workflow or the query or whatever, I am implicitly reducing cost. The way SAP is a really good example here. Like the way SAP is fast is it basically loads everything up into memory, and you're paying big money for that system to just run with all the data in memory. And that's fast, but you're paying for it. And so, any way you can reduce the complexity by doing various modeling activities like this, the schema in SAP is horrendous to look at. So get it downstream into your data warehouse, get it denormalized so that you're not doing 55 joins at a time just to get a customer record. And then, maybe get some orders, etc., to determine LTV. If I've already aggregated LTV and I do that like, once a day or something like that, like I'm in a pretty good spot as far as like understanding what's going on, and I've reduced my cost dramatically. Trade a little bit of, so it's like where's the trade-off, right? This gets back to what I said at the start of this whole conversation, which was like, what's the trade-off between cost and time, and where do I need to tune the knob? Because there's no correct answer for everybody. There's not even a correct answer within a particular organization, because depending on what question I'm trying to answer, I might lean one way or the other. Always having the option to do in the warehouse is a good thing, but also having the option, where it makes sense to call out against the source systems is useful. And then I think another thing there is just because I think it's the next topic is like accessing those source systems, like giving the MCP or the CLI, et cetera, access into the source system. So these source systems, like an ERP is a basically the data mode of an entire organization is in their ERP. People should only be able to access what they should be able to access. I shouldn't have access to all the customer information for some of our clients in their SAP instance. Okay, so when I log in, should I be able to see all those client records or not? Well, let's just say I have an SAP login and I don't have access. When I use these LLM-based tools, it should authenticate as me or authorize as me so that it's going out to SAP, trying to pull customer records, says you don't have access to pull these customer records. And then, basically I'm unable to do that analysis because I'm not supposed to be able to access that data. And so, controlling that authentication and authorization, pipeline within MCP is kind of complicated because it depends on the implementation of every single MCP. It depends on the implementation of every single CLI. Google Workspace, they have their Google Workspace CLI, Google Cloud, AWS, Azure, they all have their CLI tool, which also inherently provides authentication and authorization. So the role-based access control and IAM should be propagated through using the tool calls with the CLI, et cetera, to capture the information into the context. But not every MCP has robust, like OAuth based or human based authentication. Sometimes it's authenticating as a service account, which might have super privileged access. And understanding what the implications are for that is a pretty big deal. Like me and Ross were talking recently about a customer where we have a bunch of metadata in the data warehouse and a bunch of files in OneDrive and SharePoint for that customer. And using like the MCP to go query which files we care about and then doing some RAG, against like those files by calling out to OneDrive or SharePoint. And how how do we make sure that that user can access some of those files because those files are privileged access? And so, where's the line? Do you do that on the file basis? Do you do that on the individual metadata rows within the data warehouse? What makes sense? Really depends. I think for that particular customer, we're going to do it on like the file storage for OneDrive and SharePoint because there's not a good way to know who should really get access as like the data team to those individual files within the data warehouse. And so they'll manage that access there. RAG will short circuit, be like, okay, I can't get that file, and then, be able to go on from there for the users.
Yeah, right. So, like, in an ideal world, if you're a company, like allowing people in your organization to use AI to then access data and answer questions they weren't able to answer before, the idea here is that AI to be built on top of the SSO, the authorization infrastructure that you've already built. So if you're in the Microsoft ecosystem, you want it to reference everything that's in Entra. If you're in the Google ecosystem, you want people to only have access to the documents in Google Drive that they had access to previously, whether they're asking AI or whether they're going directly to Drive themselves. My perception here, James, is that the CLI ecosystem is somewhat more mature with regard to authentication than the MCP ecosystem, where people might be copy pasting long-lived API credentials into their like MCP integrations. How do people think about validating that the tools they're exposing are sort of the right interface and that they integrate nicely into the security ecosystem that they have established?
Yeah, I mean, this is an implementation detail of the MCPs themselves. So it's not an CLI is better compared to MCP. It's like, does the MCP provide the auth flow into their single sign-on? Can I log in as me to this MCP? Or does this MCP get provisioned by my company within my Claude account, which implicitly has like, a service account token or something like that attached to it? Now, I can tell you that that one is way easier to implement as a SaaS company. But like the very next day, you're gonna get I don't want to give keys to the kingdom access to everybody, right? Small businesses won't care as much about read-only access to everything, but you get more than a small business, even mid-size, or you have compliance obligations, etc. And suddenly, like it matters a lot. So I think that like a lot of these MCPs, because the whole point of the MCP is like get to market really quickly with a tool that supports AI workflows, like just the LLM workflow that we're used to, not even agentic. It's just get to market with something. Well, if I'm gonna build something like get to market like this week, I'm gonna build it with a service account token, like admin provision, boom, 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 boom. Like just move on with my life, right? But then the very next thing has to be like auth as the user, and MCP supports that. So it's not like the CLI is better than the MCP for this. Like it's just that every CLI basically has the built-in auth mechanism, like a Kubernetes CLI, kubectl, the Databricks CLI, the AWS Azure, Google CLI, the Google Workspace CLI, blah blah blah. All those things have auth as kind of like a prerequisite. That's why they built CLIs for them anyways. It's to like give people the ability to manage the resources that they can. Whereas the MCP is an immature like offering. CLI has been around for I don't know 40, 50 years or something like that, maybe even longer than that. Like whenever the computer was invented, basically we got CLIs. So the way that MCP was originally designed, like we're gonna have to have an MCP v2, which like kind of handles a lot of these things. But right now, like it's get to market, like move fast, you know, enable capabilities that weren't able to be enabled before, and then deal with the security when it's required of us to deal with the security, which is how the SaaS companies are taking it because like they just got to ship something. And then when their client comes to them with like, no, it needs to meet because we have FDA compliance or SEC compliance or FERPA or HIPAA or, et cetera. Those are the factors that force them into, okay, now we have to provide the authentication and authorization workflow such that like it's tied to the user because we also have the auditability or accounting requirement of who's accessing this data, et cetera. Like HIPAA is a really good example here with like patient information. Really, most people shouldn't get access to patient information unless you're like the provider for the most part, or you're like a claims person for the billing side. For us, like you shouldn't be able to access it. And so when you attempt to access it, I'm just going to be like, I log a decision that said I didn't give you access to call that table or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just interesting in the conversation about AI agents and security. I think that like a lot of the conversation sort of treats these AI agents as like independent actors. But the more we have this conversation, the more the more the the viewpoint really is that an AI agent, for the most part, for the vast majority of use cases, going to be authenticating as a human and going to have the exact same permissions that the human that human has. And then also from the MCP perspective or from the CLI perspective, they're going to be exposing authentication methods that, for the most part, are going to be using authentication as that human. And then obviously there's going to be sort of like the workflow automation path where you've got service accounts and you've got API tokens and stuff like that. But I think the vast majority of the use cases that I think will lead to the utilization of MCP servers, in particular CLIs as well, are the ones where it's the user who needs to solve a problem or answer a question using those integrations. I wonder what you think about that.
Most CLIs also have a client API library that's the equivalent. Like the CLI is usually generated from the client API library, like Kubernetes, kubectl, Google Workspace, Google Cloud, AWS, etc. Like those are just client libraries that are generating a CLI. Basically, like AWS is like the monstrosity of a Java repo with 9 billion methods on it, and so like untenable for an MCP to do that. but we have a client library, right? And we have so like I think that the interaction pattern can be basically the same for, this like agentic workflows as humans, but like your compliance is not keeping up with the rate of change of technology. Like, the humans have to be in the loop on certain things that legally they're required to be in the loop, even though you would think like, well, I can automate that process. There's a lot of things in healthcare and finance that kind of meet that mold. With respect to that, right? Like, what guardrails am I putting on the AI agent? So, like, hey, the workflow automation, right, is pretty highly guardrailed in terms of like, I'm gonna call Claude with this prompt and get this output. I'm gonna make sure it returns it as a JSON and then pass that into this next piece of the next, right? Like that's just a heavily guardrailed like process. I can easily imagine, a lot of like supply chain use cases where, really it's like go ask five questions in some places, make a decision, theoretically it's a rules engine, but like you want to give it a little bit more wiggle room. Okay, hey, I just made an agentic AI employee doing that. But then that service account should be authenticated to only get access to the things it needs access to. So, you're treating it the same way as you would treat a human, even though it's a service account. And so you could like onboard employees from like the governance control standpoint the same way. Basically you treat like agentic AI employees the same way as you would regular employees from access provisioning viewpoint. And like how many of these workers am I going to have because the workflow is t takes time and I want to be able to run five of them at the same time. Is it the same authentication? Do I split it up? I don't know. Depends on like what type of accounting I need to provide to it, right? Like which particular worker.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. It also makes me think that, what we're leading toward is sort of a unification of the authentication layer. When I think about like the process automation work that we've done historically in a pre-AI world, we were sort of provisioning service account credentials in each platform that workflow needed to access, like on a like sort of thing, or this service account inside of your cloud platform has access to these services. But hearing you describe that, it makes me think that actually the way that you're going to issue credentials for particular agents that are doing particular workflows is going to look very similar, or basically be in the exact same platform that you're issuing credentials to your employees, because you're trying to manage and govern across all of the systems your organization touches, you know, what is allowed and what is disallowed for this particular entity, whether that be a human or an AI agent. Am I thinking about that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I mean, I think about it in terms of I'm going to use acronyms now. AAA and IAM. So AAA is authentication, authorization, accountability. So like, who am I? What can I do? And what did I do? And then IAM, identity access management. So how do I provision access? If I'm sufficiently large, my IAM strategy needs to be pretty tight to like only give access to these particular resources, etc. So onboarding an AI agent employee or whatever is like create a user that's a service account type user and then give them access to a group which does all the permissioning across everything else. And so like, let's just use Google Cloud. Like, okay, I'm a member of the supply chain analyst group. So now I get all the supply chain analyst like capabilities, etc. But then like, tied into all of that stuff is my tray, like what's my seam, etc. That all has to be integrated throughout everything.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'd love to dive deeper, but we're running out of time here. So, looking at the like last question, it's 2028. MCP is as foundational to enterprise AI as REST APIs are to the web today. What does the world look like for a data team that prepared well versus one that treated this as someone else's infrastructure problem?
Well, I mean, do they have a job in this
Let's
scenario?
say yes.
Because if you didn't prepare well, your costs have exploded, right? Like to the point we talked about earlier. So performance is really a cost lever. And so if a data team hasn't taken on the work, then they're gonna they're not gonna be competitive in the market because their cost to do the things is gonna be higher, not just from like labor standpoint, but also from the compute standpoint. So unless they got crazy margins, like I don't know if that company is going to be. Also, I don't think it's 2028. Like I think it's a little bit further out, but like the the capabilities will create like this AI agent employee that the AI agent employee is doing most of the work. Potentially most of the people who are doing the white collar work are in this manager type role where they're reviewing the work done by 20 agents, and that's enough throughput that like you're kind of mostly in a review phase that creates the feedback loop into the system. And I think like MCPs versus CLIs versus like natural language. It's just like the way that they integrate across everything. And MCPs are just kind of like that, like go to market like quickly, create an integration pathway, and then like naturally as you evolve, if you have enough complexity, you're going to need to move towards like a CLI oriented workflow or a selective kind of MCP, which reduces the context volume in the same way that CLIs do. And then, eventually, okay, hey, I got this MCP v2 thing. Maybe I don't need to go through and build out a CLI, but as the MCPs evolve, you kind of like have your framework to build up a CLI accordingly, because like you're trying to figure out what are the boundaries that need to exist and why those boundaries need to exist. And then how do I drive the IAM authentication into everything, etc.
Yeah, and the thing that comes to mind for me is basically that, you know, obviously the thing you mentioned up front was that that like your costs have exploded because you're trying to do all of this stuff with AI without sort of setting up your infrastructure in a way to allow you to accomplish the goals to, drive the use cases that you have internally effectively at a cost basis that's sustainable for you. And, what I see sometimes is that companies either want to jump to that place of just let's just do everything without building any infrastructure or thinking about what we're going to do ahead of time. Or there's another category of company that's very cost focused that is just unwilling to either try or build the foundational infrastructure that they need in order to drive any of the use cases. And so a company like that, looks, very similar in 10 years or in 5 years to the way that it looks now, because the fear of cost is preventing them from doing any experimentation or with doing any investment in the foundational infrastructure that will allow them to accelerate and improve as an organization. And I think, like both of those are sort of the wrong path. The right path is documenting your use cases, understanding what value you're trying to drive, and then building the foundational infrastructure, investing in that infrastructure so that you can accelerate along that path sustainably and maintainably rather than, running up a hill that's much steeper than it should be, or, just not running at all because it's too steep to try to climb.
I mean, this is where FOMO is a driving factor. Somebody's scared that they're going to get left behind because they don't want, like, Blockbuster's a case study, right? Like in business school, like what happens when you don't innovate, right? And so you don't want to be in the innovator's dilemma where you're the person spending all the capital to innovate. Instead, you're like looking for your vendors or things like that to kind of help you get there, because like for most businesses, unless you're like Fortune 500 or Anthropic or things like this, like you're in a landscape, a lot of the stuff is commoditized. You're just trying, like you're mostly a sales and marketing engine with like operational efficiencies. Like you're just trying to run lean as you reasonably can within your slice of the market. And we we are expecting the vendors to kind of help everything along the way. Like they're investing in AI, they're investing in all these things. But like, what's their incentive model to do those types of things? Like, if you look at like a lot of these platforms, they have per user pricing. So they're actually not incentivized to help you like be operationally efficient. They're not incentivized to make you like to let you become more operationally efficient. Instead, like they're incentivized for you to be bloated in a certain context, right? Or they need to change their pricing model, which like, the we're services pricing model is a constant problem because like, what's our value add versus like our unit cost, right? And it's really hard to reframe those pricing models once they exist in the market, right? And okay, cool. So under the hood, they're not going to build their own foundational model. They're just going to call it the Claude and ChatGPT. So their unit economics are tied to the utilization rates, which probably are not tied to like humans as tightly as they are right now. So I think that there's some market dynamics that have to evolve based off the norm changes, and there's a lot of money tied up in like these market dynamics that's like not concentrated in, the five, six companies that are maybe 15 companies that are really doing AI first like orientation. And those 15 companies or so, like they're the ones who are really taking the big piece of the pie. Everybody else is just paying rent against it, right? We'll see how it really evolves. I mean, every VC is like dreaming of the world or PE or really like of the world where they flip the operating model. There's just a person who's like an SME running it, and they got 20 AI employees like doing the thing because like the error rates will go down, the cost of doing business will go down, etc. But also at that point, your unit economics have changed. So like what was my employee cost versus my token cost, etc. And so like how do I drive that? But that switch is not going to be like rapid enough to change all the pricing models of the existing ecosystem in a way that like drives everything towards that, kind of inevitable like doom and gloom future. Is yeah, all that to say, like, I'm not the crystal ball reader, but yeah, there's a lot of money outside of the AI race that is incentivized on humans doing work. Whereas like the opposite is true on the AI side. Like how do we take humans out of the loop? Because if we take humans out of the loop, then the unit economics are better for us and we can raise prices. Right. But as long as humans are in the loop, they're kind of capped on how much they can actually charge and like the efficiency gains for AI, just in general, because humans are in the loop, you can only get so much more out of a person. Right. So you're seeing somewhere between 10 and 30% kind of on average, like efficiency gains. Particular people might be 2x or 3x, but like in general, across the board, we got a 15 to 30% boost, quite a bit less than the Industrial Revolution. So you got to start making the comparisons. Now, what's happening right now is people are betting on like if you take humans out of the loop, that the multiplier goes up to like 50x, right? And then okay, now I can squeeze margin out of that because what my cost basis, let's just say the cost basis was 100 grand, but like the current AI pricing would be like $500 or something like that. Well, if I'm Anthropic, I'm charging 50, 60 grand then, right? Because I can, because the market will bear, but how do you get between where they are now and where they need to be, and like also getting all these organizations to adopt it while also keeping society intact?
Yeah, it's an interesting problem statement. Well, so like to head toward the end, we're doing this segment, what we're watching. So James, beyond the MCP itself, is there one adjacent signal in the agentic infrastructure space that you think data leaders should have on their radar right now?
I mean, we're incentivized to help people get their data together, right? So what I think about is like, how do we help people get more value out of getting their data together more efficiently so that they can determine what question they want to ask at the fidelity level that they would want to ask. So that's where I spend most of my time. The tooling in the space, like, I'm pretty much is like, look, there's five players in that space. They're competing with each other. They're stealing ideas from each other. Like they're going to do their thing. We just need to stay on top of that, figure out how it applies to our customers' workflows, and then like make sure that our customers are competitive in the market based off of these capabilities. Like that's my viewpoint. Like I don't work at Anthropic. I don't make, $1 trillion if the unique economics flip over, right? Like instead, we make our money by helping our customers be more productive by leveraging these tools more effectively. But also like a lot of the stuff we have done in the agentic AI space has been like 15-minute consultation. They answer a question they never would have been able to answer before at an 80/20 fidelity. Boom, they're on their way to solve that operational issue that they had. Like I was working with a property management group who was dealing with problems. I said, throw all your reviews into, ChatGPT or Claude or whatever. Ask it to summarize and find the biggest problem that you have. Pest control is their biggest problem after you did that. Cool. Now I'm gonna go do a study on like our pest situation to figure out what do we need to do there. Historically that was a $100,000 project. Spent 5 minutes talking to the guy, and he spent 5 minutes getting an Excel spreadsheet together from Airbnb and Verbo and stuff like that, and then it was done. So I think that like the rate of change is increasing dramatically, and the high level operators are the most effective people in this change. And so really kind of like where I'm leaning is like to be competitive in the market, how do you become the high level operator or the high level strategist that's like actually taking advantage of these capabilities so that you're not the 15% increase, you're the 5x increase, then your value proposition is much higher. And if you're sitting, on that side of the Pareto curve, then you're in a good spot.
Yeah, and relatedly, what's been on my mind lately is the idea that many of these big enterprises are the ones that have a lot of sort of momentum and stickiness behind platforms that predated, the current AI and agentic AI revolution. So this moment represents an opportunity for companies that understand where the value comes from in their business to redesign around AI at a speed that larger players couldn't possibly hope to match because they have all of that momentum built up around the legacy way of doing things. And so it's one of those moments where actually the smaller, even the medium-sized players have opportunities that the larger players don't have if they're able to understand the value and seize the moment from the investment perspective and put themselves in a position to take advantage of the efficiency gains that can be had.
Yeah, I mean the capital allocation is extreme though, right? So that's why you see like Anthropic and OpenAI flipping from a nonprofit to a for-profit, and like the mechanics of having to do that. Anthropic basically having like major equity stakes from like Amazon and things like that. Basically like the equity injection is there from those big players, knowing that like because of the amount of bureaucracy that they have, it has to be injected into smaller organizations to move the needle forward. And then as long as that company succeeds and they have a major stake in it, then like they still end up good. And then they iterate on Bedrock and Vertex AI and Azure ML, etc., right? To like say, okay, hey, here's what we're doing, right? And how we're going to like at the enterprise level solve for that. But then like the next stage bet is Anthropic or Open.
Yeah. I mean, I'm saying even beyond the AI industry, you like to your point, like that's one of the reasons why private equity is engaging in all of these large roll-ups of sort of traditional legacy businesses and, sort of trying to pour money in to do the like AI reimagining of what these businesses look like. It's because, they believe that opportunity exists to do that consolidation.
If I'm gonna use Bob as a fake name, but if Bob is 70% accurate and AI is 70% accurate and runs in a 1 second versus an hour, it's going to be AI.
Well, James, thanks for coming on the podcast today and for talking about, the emergence of MCPs. Excited to talk with you more about data in the future. That's it for this episode of Eventual Consistency. If you want to talk about your data challenges or you think we got something wrong and want to tell us how, you can find us at Cordine.com. That's CORRDYN.com. We're back in 2 weeks, and we'll try, as always, to be a touch more consistent. Thanks for listening.